For this next session of how current and future consumer privacy requirements are shaking up digital marketing and finance, we're going to be joined by InfoTrust's Lucas Long. I wanted to update everybody that May of Gulf Bank, who is supposed to join us, is feeling under the weather, so we wish her a speedy recovery. And Lucas, who I've worked quite a bit with very closely, is going to talk about governance and the future of consumer privacy requirements that are shaking up digital marketing and finance. And Lucas is our privacy expert and specialist around Tag Inspector. So we are really fortunate to have him joining us from our Barcelona office. It's nice to see you, Lucas. Thank you for joining a little bit later, and we'll turn it over to you, let you take it away.
Thank you, Pete. Yes, hopefully I can live up to the introduction. Unfortunately, May's not able to join us today. Thoughts go out to her. Hopefully she gets her voice back very soon. But I have had the pleasure of being able to speak with May quite a bit for a lot of these different strategies, as well as to work with a lot of our different clients in this space. So hopefully we can go through some of these primary challenges that organizations are facing here today and what you can do about it. So just strategies to really think about and how to really focus on those in order to excel in this new environment. So we'll get underway, and how we'll kind of walk through this is we'll look at the various different challenges being faced by organizations, and then some of the core principles to really keep top of mind and to make sure that you have in place. So if we move forward to the first challenge on the next slide. The number one challenge that many organizations are facing is, especially in the finance space, inconsistent requirements across markets and constantly shifting regulatory needs. We think about the US itself. We have Utah passing a new law last week, and then next year that puts 3 new various different state laws that we're going to have to be compliant with as it pertains to our consumer data. So we have a lot of difficulty here in defining and implementing standards because it's a constantly shifting target for what it is that we need to really build everything for, right? So inconsistent requirements. Now, in the finance sector specifically, a lot of those regulatory requirements, they're a little bit more explicitly defined. But the challenge still remains, right? So without a clear set of requirements and consumer expectations also shifting, how do you approach the process of defining standards and then getting an architecture in place to support the consumer data process? One of the big things that we've seen here to be helpful is having a role within the organization. In many organizations, the data protection officer, it's a role that's been there, or data privacy officer is a role that's been there, but they're kind of expanding in what that role needs to be. So an individual or a group within the organization that's able to really have the knowledge and then help with defining those various different standards. So the role is more so to draw the line, what can we do, what can't we do, and then provide the context necessary for any of those different marketing, advertising types of initiatives to make sure that you're staying within those lines. So beyond just the individual role to be able to support this and be able to have the knowledge of what is necessary, it's also important to define centralized global standards. Now, this may be standards just across various different business units. It could be across various different markets that you're operating in. A lot of our finance organizations that we are working with have operations both in the US as well as in Europe, as well as in other parts of the world. And obviously the requirements in the regulatory state across each of those different areas is vastly different. So distill everything down into just a core set of principles to be really focusing on and really upholding the privacy rights of the individual, and then allowing purposeful customization based upon individual needs. Now, one of the kind of core requirements here, the core principles to really keep in mind as you're thinking about distilling everything down, is the expectation of users and the concept of transparency. So being very, very clear about what data is being collected from them, how it's being used, and then what is the result for the user. And this is very, very important, especially in the banking area. There's a built-in advantage within the finance sector that clients oftentimes are logging in with you. You have a ton of personal information and spend data and whatnot to be able to really leverage. And you also have the advantage where your clients and your users, they know where they're spending their money, right? It's important though to maintain that trust with those users and not share that data and not use it for ways which are not explicitly explained to them. So there's a wealth of data available, making sure that you have those guardrails in place, making sure that you have standards defined, and you have a central role that's able to really make any modifications as well as approve any of those purposeful customizations for individual business units or for individual markets. So as we think about this, just to summarize those different points here on the next slide, our first challenge being those inconsistent requirements across markets and constantly shifting regulatory needs. The principles that we can focus on in order to really accomplish this or face this challenge are really four different things. Central role for knowledge and standards definition, having those core standards in place at the centralized global level, and then making intentful customizations, making sure that we're always transparent with the user about what data is being collected, how it is being used, and then making sure that we are following those guidelines and maintaining a high trust relationship with the client. The last thing that we want is to be creepy with any of their finance data, especially. The second challenge that many organizations are facing on this next slide here is around the deprecation of third-party cookies, and more specifically, the lack of access to different identifiers. Translation here is that we have a lot of difficulties with measurement and optimization, understanding user journey, and then cross-channel measurement. Big portions here are that inability and challenges for attribution. But here again, there is a really kind of built-in advantage within that finance section, being that a lot of those users are logged in. Melanie and Federico had touched on it in the session before with GA4. A lot of platforms, including GA4, are starting to move into this more user-based and event-based measurement model. With those user identifiers and with those user IDs, we're able to plug those in and really lean on those within our analytics platforms in order to be able to understand how our users interacting with our properties across devices, across browsers. So we can get a really holistic a look at interactions, at least. And that helps us to optimize the user experience. Now, personalization within the user experience within your actual web applications is extremely necessary, but it's only one portion of that puzzle. The other portion has to do with being able to identify users, how they're interacting with your brand outside of your actually owned and operated properties. Now, users have a much higher expectation for personalization. Some statistics that Google has put out recently was that something like 90% of users have an expectation for a customized experience with a particular brand. And that extends also to their experience with their advertising. At the same time, almost 25% of users across the globe are using technologies such as Safari or Firefox that are blocking access to third-party cookies. So when we talk about this whole cookie apocalypse and Google Chrome deprecating cookies towards the tail end of 2023, we're already in that environment, especially in this industry where you have a higher proportion of users across many of your client bases that are using Apple technologies. So how to, I guess, kind of work with and gather insights from those more anonymous data sets without the access to those identifiers. Number one, like I mentioned, lean on that identifiable named user set and really do a lot of analysis through that lens. Who are your high value users? Who are the people that you're already working with? And what content do they like? Where are they coming from? What content do they consume to be able to really inform a lot of those advertising strategies moving forward, to be able to deliver that personalized experience based upon your known insights and understanding of those core users. So deprecation of the third-party cookies and the lack of identifier access, again, kind of getting into just to summarize those core points and strategic focus on this next slide. Number one is really lean into that natural logged in advantage. Leverage it in optimal ways. Understand how are users interacting across their various different devices to be able to deliver them a really personalized experience when they're interacting with your organization. That develops brand loyalty. That keeps consumers interacting with you over time. Also lean on that logged in user sets in order to be able to understand their preferences to inform advertising strategies. We want to target more people like those that are high value for us. So what content do they consume? Where are they? How can we go out and get other users similar to them? There's also this whole concept of, because you have this large logged in data set, you have a high volume of data. This is one of the things that May has really impressed upon me in some of our past conversations, is the need to wade through that massive volume of data in order to be able to identify trends. At the end of the day, we're always getting back to trend analysis. And so even if we have less identifier access for those users outside of our owned and operated, we're still looking for trends. So it goes back to leaning on those logged in users, identify the trends, and then be able to action based upon insights. At the end of the day, yes, we're working harder because we can't just plug in technology to be able to identify users everywhere, but we're also working smarter. And this opens the door for competitive advantage for those organizations that are able to really lean on and leverage that large volume of data that they have. Moving beyond the deprecation of third-party cookies, we move into our third core challenge that many organizations are facing. And this has to do with the rising user personalization expectations, while at the same time, users are exercising their privacy rights and no longer kind of allowing for that information. Going back to my misstated statistic before, for the Google and Ipsos, they did a global trends survey in a recent privacy report ebook. The actual percentage, 91% of internet users aged 16 to 74 say that they are more likely to shop with brands that provide offers and recommendations that are relevant to them. The level of expectations that consumers have for the experience that you're delivering has never been higher. At the same time, some statistics such as ad blocker usage being between 30 and 40% across the US and EU by some estimates. It's estimated that between 30 and 40% of users are declining cookie consent on EU retail websites when presented in a compliant way. And some studies are showing that on mobile, Apple ATT opt-in rates are as low as 25%. So users aren't providing their information by and large, but at the same time have a super high expectation for the experience that is able to be delivered. So there's this mismatch. How are we able to meet and exceed these expectations with less data than we have traditionally been able to kind of have access to? So when I talk to a lot of people in the finance industry, again, for how they're approaching this value exchange, right? Ultimately, we need users to be able to provide more of their information in order to be able to provide them a better experience. And this again gets down to some of the built-in industry benefits here. Because you're able to have that large kind of volume of logged in users with many of these various different properties, you're able to identify those trends, get to really deep insights, and really segment customers in really interesting and novel ways. Then we can start building experiences around those various different segments. So building based upon, again, insights and understanding of those high value users that you're able to identify. And then we can customize the user experiences in app based upon the profile of the user. So it's super important there, having that compelling value exchange in order to be able to access more and have that higher trust relationship. And then leaning on that, once you have established that, you can then open up a whole lot of doors for additional effectiveness and for additional strategies. Now, a lot of talk also is often put forth around different types of value exchanges. What is a compelling value exchange for users? Some of the different topics that kind of areas that I've seen across the finance industry have been personalizing rewards, and then also really importantly, customizing that user experience. So customizing based upon the segments, and then providing relevant content and less pain points for the various different actions that each of those different consumer segments are wanting to accomplish with your organization. So that third challenge, again, rising user expectations met at the same time with limited access to data. And to summarize some of those core portions here, on that next slide, we can really focus on leveraging that user-provided information. Number one, getting more of that user-provided information, which is a natural outgrowth of the user relationship with the user and having that high trust. That goes back to some of those first principles that we talked about around transparency. Being very transparent around what information is collected, how it is being used, and making sure that it is not being shared with partners in ways that do not align with that very different expectation. But providing that value exchange, having that high trust relationship allows you to get more information. We can then start to segment based upon all of that different user data, identify those different trends, who are our different customer segments, what do they care about, and then we can start to really personalize the experience in order to drive more value and just provide more value to the user at the end of the day. Our fourth challenge kind of just encapsulates a lot of the issues, I guess, that are being faced right now, and is one of the really core fundamental pieces. And the fourth challenge is that there's just so much uncertainty with the regulatory changes, as we mentioned before, with the various different strategies that are available, what's even going to be available from a technology standpoint. We're in the midst of, as we talked about in the previous session, migrating to GA4. And so what does that look like for our organization? So many questions of just, where do we start? How can we even approach building out any of these new types of strategies, focusing on the users? Should we be building new user experiences? Should we be segmenting users? Should we be thinking about different ways of targeting individuals for brand acquisition? And how do we also get full educational buy-in for a lot of these different initiatives, which is really a key imperative piece for all of this. So number one, where to start is there's a component of education that's really necessary here throughout the entire organization. So as we're talking about delivering better consumer experiences and really putting the consumer first, not just from traditionally we talk about putting the consumer first for just how we're going about different activities, but now putting the consumer first in terms of their privacy rights and expectations as well. That is critical, and having that educational component throughout the organization of this is what we can do, this is what we can't do, and this is what our values are. this is how we're going to use data. And having that really permeate throughout is the first big step here. Number two, in order to calm a lot of that uncertainty, is to really drive a lot of internal data privacy awareness initiatives. And a lot of this comes from that role, the centralized role that we talked about earlier, that really owns a lot of this information and really owns a lot of this knowledge. So again, defining the standards and then communicating those standards across the organization. What data is private? What data is not necessarily private? What are the rules that we are playing by? And then making sure that we have those ongoing trainings. There's also an important call out here for that DPO and that centralized role. One of the things that we're seeing, especially in the finance industry, is that data protection officer kind of as more of a outside service organizations. So some of the smaller organizations in the space, especially some of the newer fintech type of organizations, are really leaning on some of these external partners in order to be able to stand this up. So it's very often not a centralized role that an organization will have internally as of today. It really then at that point becomes more of a decision. Do we want to develop this in-house? Do we want to go externally in order to be able to get some of this guidance? And then finally, for helping with this uncertainty is surfacing, again, those standards. Defining standards, servicing those standards, making sure that everyone is aware of what those kind of rules of the game are, and making sure that everyone is following them. All of these different principles can reduce that uncertainty and help you to lay out and kind of perform a gap analysis, identify what are we good at, what are we not good at today, and then what do we need to build in order to be able to really define that roadmap into the future. So if we summarize some of these principles here around this challenge for where do we start, and this question for where do we start, the strategic focus that we really want to think about is number one, education within the organization. It's not just one person that cares about privacy, everyone should. And it should be embedded within the activities and strategies from top to bottom. Number two is really clearly define the rules that everyone is working with and making sure that those rules are being upheld. The easiest way and the most direct way of doing this is defining those standards, making sure that that is embedded within the organization, within the culture. And then also, beyond just defining standards, making sure that they're available and everyone has easy access to what those are and is able to personalize those to their various different activities. So we've covered a lot of ground here today, went through the 4 different challenges. And so kind of want to summarize everything and pull it all together. So on this last slide, to summarize, the privacy-centric marketing environment, it imposes a lot of new challenges, both on data access as well as on activation of the data that you have access to. What this really means is that there is a massive opportunity for competitive advantage for the organizations that do this really well. If you have that strong relationship with users, if you have that large logged in data set, if you're able to identify trends, if you're able to really cleanly and clearly define your customer segments, there are a lot of insights that can be pulled from those data sets that you can then start to personalize experience, increasing customer loyalty, as well as better understand those high value users so you can go out and find others like them. So in order to do that, focus on a few core key things. Number one, develop and maintain those high trust relationships with users, define those organizational standards, and then educate everyone within the organization around those. Work harder because we're having to develop new models, find new ways of attributing conversion, signups, and everything back to our different advertising activities, but also work smarter. Derive those insights, create that competitive advantage. We're able to, if we can tie all this together, provide a really tangible benefit to our users so that we have that value proposition for the data exchange, but ultimately we're able to meet and exceed those expectations that users have today while at the same time exceeding their requirements and expectations for privacy.
Thank
So
you,
yeah,
Lucas, for joining us. This was a really useful session. Like the notion that privacy-centric marketing environment does impose new challenges on access and activation, but at the same time, kind of going back to our conversation with Shauna this morning, that's opportunity for competitive advantage, right? Challenges are an opportunity that, with the shifts in privacy regulations, change in user behavior through COVID, that those expectations of consumers are a lot higher. And they have much more control to access to brand than they ever had before, or making decisions around that. And so I think this is a really great points for the audience to take home and think about. And Lucas, again, thank you so much for rolling solo today and carrying the conversation.